open the package, grab the tube, spit in it, put it back in the box, put the label on, and send it to the lab. DNA test services like 23andMe have made it quick, easy, and cheap to test our DNA. A God-given miracle it may seem, but are we ready for the consequences? And that is exactly what we'll be talking about today. 23andMe, a California-based company founded in 2006 and one of the biggest players in the private genome market with over 10 million customers. For as little as €200, you can use their services to learn about your own genetic health markers and ancestry. And naturally, this gives rise to some interesting questions. What's so interesting about this information? What happens to your data? And what are the implications for society? The opportunities, the threats. Let's start at the beginning. Why do people get their genome sequenced? It turns out humans are quite curious, with the question, where did we come from, being one of our most fundamental ones. So, it won't come as a surprise that in a survey conducted by 23andMe under 600 participants, that half of them tested their DNA to learn about their ancestry. This is reflected in the multi-billion-dollar genealogy industry, which is a branch of business that focuses on human heritage. This market attracts big players like Airbnb, who have partnered up with 23andMe to organize heritage travels, exotic trips to the lands of your forefathers. But not only do we have a burning desire to learn about our past, we also seek to get some insights into our future. The health reports that 23andMe provide might be a valuable tool in decoding our future, although the company clearly states that its tests should not be used to predict or diagnose illness. Knowing in advance what diseases you are predisposed to can be helpful though. For example, if you have genetic markers that indicate a heightened risk of Alzheimer's, perhaps you should drink a few less drinks every week. On the flip side, humans are prone to the placebo and nocebo effect, which means that merely thinking we have an issue could actually create an issue. This could mean that if you believe that you have an increased chance at Alzheimer's, you might actually have an increased chance of getting Alzheimer's. By itself, this is an issue. But to make matters worse, a 2018 study done in Genetics in Medicine showed that 40% of business-to-consumer genetic tests resulted in false positives, meaning that a test can find genetic markers that put you at an increased risk of Alzheimer's whilst actually not being true, creating unnecessary anxiety in the process. Yes, human nature can be tricky. But what about the machines? Once you get your genome tested, all the data is stored on a server. Since 23andMe is GDPR compliant, you maintain full control and access over your data. This sounds good on paper, but what does practice actually show? When creating your 23andMe account, you get asked to anonymously participate in medical research. By opting in, you give 23andMe and its partners access to your DNA data. The company also proudly exclaims that you automatically contribute to over 230 genetic studies. In itself, this is great. Access to mesh genetic data exponentially speeds up the rate of research, opening up a whole new frontier when it comes to personalized medicine and rare genetic disorders. But meanwhile, 23andMe is also sharing your data with their partner, GlaxoSmithKline, a pharmaceutical company who has gotten the biggest fine in US history, coming in at $3 billion. Now, this might be considered a one-off, until you realize that they've also gotten the biggest fine in Chinese history, coming in at over $600 million. This is an example of what could happen with the GDPR. In countries where there's no strict policy on data regulation and privacy, your data could easily fall into the wrong hands. Perhaps an employer doesn't want to hire someone because they've got a genetic predisposition for getting cancer, and that will result in high costs in sick leave. Or maybe an insurance company just ups your premium because you are at a higher risk of diabetes. Then there is the question of security. In 2018, MyHeritage, who is one of the biggest players in the business-to-consumer DNA market, reported a breach in which information of over 92 million users was stolen. You might think to yourself, why would I care? I live in a well-regulated and privacy-oriented country. Well, it turns out that personal medical data is some of the most sought after and valuable information. Perhaps it can't be abused yet, but this data exists for life, and so does your genome. A decade from now, someone might engineer a bioweapon specifically targeting your DNA. But luckily the knife cuts both ways. Genetically engineered bioterrorism is a valid concern, but
But luckily our means of tracking down these criminals will also improve. Because of the access to large DNA databanks, the police have been able to solve many cold murder cases which were thought to be unsolvable.
One of the most noticeable is that of the Golden State Killer, a serial killer who raped and murdered dozens of women almost 40 years ago. The interesting part is how the case was solved. The police already had DNA data on the killer for decades, but they had no way to link it to the perpetrator. But with the help of modern-day databanks, they were able to cross-reference the genetic data and find distant relatives of the murderer. Using this lead, it was just a matter of time before they found the 72-year-old killer at his house in California. What stands out in this case is that it's not the killer's genetic data that was stored in the databanks, but that of his relatives. According to an article published in Science, it only takes 2% of human genetic profiles to track down any individual in the world. This has some daunting implications, because your privacy is put in the hands of those around you. Belgium, for example, takes this very seriously and only allows access to a DNA databank when there is a direct link to a crime. But other countries, like the Netherlands, are way more lenient and allow cross-referencing of data for any crime that has a prison sentence for 6 years or longer, regardless of the proof. Lastly, there is the issue of parenthood. Within 23andMe, you are able to connect with unknown family members. Now, this can lead to some tricky situations. To combat this, 23andMe doesn't allow minors to test without consent of their guardians. But this too can result in very shady situations. Perhaps a father isn't sure if a child is his. He could just order 2 23andMe kits online and know within a couple of weeks. Businesses build on rediscovering our heritage, storing medical data and selling it to the highest bidders, tracking murderers, finding family members, and cementing our genomes in the cloud. The DNA frontier is riddled with ethical dilemmas. DNA testing has become cheaper, easier, and more convenient than ever. But for every dilemma that we solve, 2 more pop up. The best that we can do as individuals and as a society is have an open debate and talk about the ethical implications. With the rise of gene editing software and other genetic innovations, these questions only become more pressing and disrupting. This is our heritage, and we have to decide where we take it.